My grandson pushed away my cane as if it were a symbol of shame rather than a safeguard against falling. His words sounded like a verdict: stand up or fall. I stayed silent, because there was no point in arguing with youth that had yet to understand the fragility of bones or the weight of years. But 2 days later, his knees trembled before me, and he was begging for a place to sit. I didn't rush. Time delivered my answer for me. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Charles Whitaker. I was 74 years old, and I had lived in the same house in central Iowa for nearly 5 decades. It wasn't large or impressive. 2 bedrooms, creaky wooden floors, a drafty back door that never quite sealed right. But it was mine. I bought it with the modest salary I earned as a high school history teacher, back when men like me were expected to work quietly and endure everything without complaint. That's exactly what I did, year after year, until I retired and watched my days stretch out like long shadows across the backyard. The house was built in 1949. Solid bones, they said. Red bricks, wide front porch, a sloping roof I'd patched myself more times than I could count. Every nail in that place had felt the weight of my hands. Every creak in the hallway echoed with the memory of steps. Mine, my wife's, and later, when he was little, my grandson's. The air inside smelled faintly of old pine, worn books, and the subtle comfort of coffee grounds that seemed to linger long after the pot had been washed. I spent most mornings on the back porch. There was an oak tree in the yard, older than the house itself. Its roots ran deep beneath the garden beds, curling around the foundation like a silent protector. I used to sit and watch the wind move through its branches, the way the leaves shimmered under the early sun. That tree was my mirror. Bent with age, bark cracked and weathered, but still standing. Still useful in its own quiet way. My knees were beginning to betray me. I could feel them falter with each climb up the porch steps, each walk from the kitchen to the bedroom. My left hip ached in the mornings, the result of an old fall I never mentioned to anyone. I didn't want sympathy. I wanted peace. I wanted dignity. That's why I kept my cane nearby, not as a crutch, but as an extension of my will. It wasn't flashy, just a smooth piece of hickory with a curve at the top, worn where my fingers had rested. It had seen me through slick winters and long grocery store lines. It was dependable. That cane had become part of my daily ritual, like the morning paper or the first cup of tea. Since Margaret died, the silence had become a second skin. She passed 3 years ago, in the same bedroom we'd shared since 1975. I hadn't changed much since then. Her slippers still sat beneath the bed. Her scarf hung by the door. I wasn't clinging to the past. I just didn't see the point in erasing her from the present. The world did that enough already, stripping away our names, our memories, one forgetful gesture at a time. My grandson, Ethan, was 21, tall, impatient, and full of the kind of energy that mistook speed for direction. He came around now and then, usually when he needed something, a little money, a quiet place to sleep off a bad decision, or just a reminder that someone in the world still remembered his middle name. I didn't mind his visits. I even welcomed them, though I rarely said so out loud. Watching him move around my kitchen, open the fridge, check his phone, it was like looking through a window into a world I didn't belong to anymore. He didn't understand what the house meant to me. To him, it was just old. Like the books on my shelf, the VHS tapes in the cabinet, the faded photographs in frames that hadn't been dusted in too long. He joked once that the entire place looked like a museum. I smiled and nodded, because I'd stopped explaining things to people who had never lived without Wi-Fi. He was a good kid, in theory, but theory has never held much weight in the face of real time, real pain, real choices. I noticed lately that he grew restless when I moved too slowly. If I reached for the cane, his eyes would roll, subtle, but there. If I paused to steady myself before sitting, his foot would tap. When I asked him to hand me the watering can for the porch plants, he tossed it toward me without looking up from his phone. Not out of cruelty, but indifference. I wasn't a person to him in those moments. I was an obstacle, an old tree in the way of his shortcut. But I was still rooted. My days began early and ended quietly. I tended the yard, though less efficiently than I used to. I kept up with the bills, the laundry, the maintenance. I liked order. I always had. Even when my hands trembled, I folded the napkins into squares and lined them in the drawer. There was a comfort in routine, a logic. And logic, I believed, was the last thing left to a man when the world stopped listening to him. I'd spent my life teaching history, showing kids that the past had weight, that it mattered, that every name carved into a forgotten desk or etched into a stone monument had meant something to someone. Now, my own name seemed to drift like dust in the late afternoon light, still present, but mostly ignored. On Sundays I read. The same chair, the same lamp, the same silence. I liked biographies, real people with real failures, not the flashy kind, but the slow unraveling of ordinary life, the way things turn quietly before they break. I often wondered if anyone would ever write mine. I doubted it, but if they did, I hoped they'd include the part about the tree in the backyard, and how I once believed that aging could be something noble. When the phone rang, I didn't rush. I couldn't anymore, and maybe I didn't want to. Calls were usually either wrong numbers or reminders about prescriptions. Sometimes it was Ethan, asking if he could crash for a night or use the truck. I said yes. I always said yes, not out of obligation, but because I remembered being young and needing somewhere to go. I never told him how it felt to be watched like a relic, how it chipped at me, piece by piece, until I became quieter than I intended. I never mentioned that sometimes I rehearsed standing up in the privacy of my room, just to see if I could do it without wobbling. These things belonged to me, like the knots in the tree outside, invisible unless you knew where to look. That cane had held me up more times than I could count, not just physically, but emotionally. When Margaret died, I walked the entire cemetery with it, refusing the golf cart they offered. When I got the news that my pension would be reduced, I gripped the cane like it might hold back the tides. It never spoke, never asked anything of me, but it had more patience than most people I knew. So when Ethan looked at that cane with thinly veiled contempt, it stung in a place deeper than pride. It felt like someone tossing your family Bible into a box labeled "Donate," like someone wiping away your name from the mailbox because the ink was fading. But I said nothing. I had grown used to holding my thoughts the way I held that cane, firmly, but without shaking. The house, the tree, the silence, they all bore witness. And so did I. I always believed a house could hold memory the way skin holds scars, not dramatic or loud, but persistent, layered, and quietly telling. Every scratch on the woodwork, every smudge on the hallway wall, every uneven patch in the ceiling paint, told a story. I didn't need photographs to remember. The house remembered for me. I began my mornings the same way, not because I had to, but because repetition brought comfort. I woke up before the sun had fully crested over the tops of the neighborhood trees. The light that seeped through the lace curtains in the bedroom had a softness to it, muted, forgiving. My bones ached a little less in those moments, before the full weight of the day settled into my joints. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, sat for a moment to steady my balance, and then reached instinctively for the cane leaning against the nightstand. It was always there, just where I left it, as though it too had its own rituals. The floorboards creaked beneath my steps, greeting me like old friends. I moved slowly through the hallway, trailing my hand along the wall as I passed the marks we'd once made to measure Ethan's height. The pencil lines were faint now, nearly faded into the paint. But I remembered each one. I remembered the day we made the last mark, how he had stood straighter than usual, hoping to appear taller. I hadn't painted over those lines. I never would. The hallway opened into the kitchen, and the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound besides the rhythmic tap of my cane. The counter still bore the knife marks from decades of chopping, and the linoleum was worn through in front of the sink where I used to stand doing dishes next to Margaret. The wallpaper had started to curl at the edges, especially near the window where the morning light hit strongest. I had meant to replace it for years, but each time I thought about it, I stopped. There was something honest about its wear, like it had aged with me and deserved to stay. I filled the kettle and placed it on the stove, letting the click of the burner break the silence. The gas flame came alive with a familiar whoosh, and I stood there, hand resting on the handle of the cane, waiting. The kettle took its time. I liked that. It didn't rush, didn't beep, didn't flash instructions at me. It simply boiled when it was ready. I found comfort in things that didn't demand. Once the tea was steeping, I carried it carefully to the small table near the window. That table had once been filled with books and magazines, sometimes Ethan's schoolwork when he was young. Now it was just me, a mug, and the newspaper. I didn't always read it thoroughly anymore. The headlines exhausted me. But the act of opening it, folding it just right, smoothing out the pages with both hands, that still felt like something worth doing. The living room was a time capsule. The same brown recliner, the same coffee table with a chipped corner, the same bookshelf Margaret had filled with everything from Steinbeck to cookbooks. There was a thin layer of dust now, not from neglect, but from a lack of use. Guests no longer visited often. Most of the people we'd once hosted were either gone or too far away. And the younger ones, like Ethan, didn't linger long in rooms that smelled of time. I dusted when I could, rearranged the cushions to keep the fabric from creasing too deeply, and opened the windows on warmer days to let the air circulate. Still, the house had a stillness that clung to it. Not unpleasant, just complete, like it had exhaled and was now resting. In the corner near the front door stood a coat rack, tall and wooden, with curved hooks. Margaret's raincoat still hung there. I hadn't moved it. Her scarf, too. The soft gray one she wore during chilly autumn evenings when we used to sit on the porch. I sometimes found myself brushing my fingers across its folds, not out of grief, but habit, as if by doing so I was pressing play on some old recording only I could hear. The walls bore the residue of decades, faint outlines where portraits used to hang, discoloration from old smoke when I still used to light the occasional pipe, nail holes filled, but still visible if you knew where to look. I never considered repainting. That would be like rewriting something already true. These walls had heard everything: laughter, arguments, silence, music, the slow breathing of illness, the whispers of love after midnight. They had heard Ethan's first words, and Margaret's last. The hallway leading to the bedrooms had a mirror at the end. Narrow, with an ornate brass frame I'd found at a yard sale in 1982. I rarely looked into it directly anymore. Not because I was ashamed, but because what stared back wasn't someone I immediately recognized. The man in the glass had weathered features and tired eyes. He looked like someone who had spent a lifetime staying upright. And maybe that was true. There was an old radio in the kitchen, next to the spice rack. I turned it on sometimes, not for music, but for the human voice. A talk show, an interview, even the dry ramblings of AM news gave the illusion of company. On most days, the silence didn't bother me. But there were moments when it pressed in too tightly, and I needed the static hum of life to push it back. I noticed the way sunlight changed the character of each room. In the early morning, the light through the east window gave the kitchen a golden tint, soft and forgiving. By afternoon, the living room was bathed in harsher light, illuminating the dust, the age, the stillness. At dusk, the house dimmed gently, as if turning inward, curling up like a cat ready for sleep. Everything I needed was within reach. I kept things where they had always been. Out of routine, yes, but also out of an unwillingness to yield to the chaos of change. My pills were lined up in the cabinet alphabetically. My socks folded just the way Margaret had taught me. My keys hung on the same hook by the door. These were not signs of rigidity. They were my way of maintaining the small borders of dignity in a world that seemed to constantly move the lines. The walls didn't ask questions. They didn't judge. They accepted the slowness of my steps, the weight of the cane, the long pauses between tasks. They welcomed me each morning and wrapped around me each night. They were mine, and I belonged to them. Sometimes I would sit in the armchair and let my eyes wander. I would trace the grooves in the floorboards with my gaze, follow the lines of the ceiling where the plaster had cracked. I would listen to the house breathe, the groan of wood shifting, the distant hum of the furnace, the subtle rustle of wind against the siding. I didn't need conversation. The house spoke in a language I understood. There was a photograph on the mantel. Margaret and I, young and smiling, standing beside the very same tree that still grew out back. I kept it dusted. I didn't talk to it, didn't light candles or whisper prayers, but I looked at it each evening, just once, before turning in. A small acknowledgement, a silent ritual. The house had become more than shelter. It was the last place where I was still fully myself, not reduced to grandpa, not dismissed as an old man with a cane. Within these walls, I was Charles. I was teacher, husband, father, steward of memory. My hands had built shelves, cooked meals, tucked in children. My voice had filled the rooms with lectures, lullabies, and quiet humming while folding laundry. Outside, the world was fast, impatient, indifferent. Inside, everything still moved at the pace of breath, and breath, I had learned, was enough. I had always believed that youth moved with a kind of arrogance, too fast to see where it was going, too loud to hear what had already been said. Ethan embodied that belief in full. He burst into the house like a gust of wind that had no idea where it came from or what it might knock over. His energy unsettled the stillness I had built, and yet, some part of me welcomed it. The way you might welcome a summer storm after a long drought, not because you enjoy the chaos, but because silence can become too heavy. He arrived late in the afternoon, unannounced as usual. I heard his car before I saw it, the low hum of a too-loud engine and the dull thump of bass-heavy music that vibrated through the front door. I didn't get up. I sat in my armchair and waited, listening to the rattle of his keys, the shuffle of his sneakers on the porch, the impatient twist of the doorknob. He never knocked. He simply entered, as if the house still belonged to some version of his childhood. He dropped his bag in the hallway like it was something he couldn't wait to be rid of. His footsteps echoed through the house, too fast, too heavy, like he didn't realize the walls were thinner now, the floorboards older. He smelled like gasoline and sweat, and something chemical I couldn't place. His voice filled the room before he did, loud and casual, tossed out like a stone into still water. I turned my head slightly to acknowledge him, but he was already moving past me, already opening the fridge, already complaining about how there was never anything to eat. I watched him from the corner of my eye as he stood there, tall and restless, scanning the shelves like he expected something to appear if he stared long enough. He closed the door with a thud and reached for a bag of chips from the pantry, crunching loudly as he leaned against the counter, one foot tapping in rhythmless urgency. He talked without pause, about his job, or lack of one, about a girl whose name he didn't bother to repeat, about how things were messed up and unfair, and how nobody got it anymore. His words spilled out like water from a cracked faucet, constant, aimless, noisy. I listened, not because I had anything to say, but because I knew he needed a witness more than an answer. He glanced at the cane leaning beside my chair and let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. I noticed the way his eyes lingered on it, the faint curl of his lip, the unspoken commentary wrapped in silence. He didn't say anything, but he didn't have to. The gesture was enough. He saw it as a weakness, an inconvenience, a marker of everything he didn't want to become. I didn't explain the cane to him. I never had. I didn't tell him about the fall in the garage, the weeks of therapy, the slow rebuilding of balance. I didn't tell him about the mornings I woke up afraid to put weight on my legs, or the nights I held the edge of the sink just to stay upright. He wouldn't have understood, not because he lacked empathy, but because he hadn't yet lived through a day that turned on him without warning. Youth, I'd found, is a kind of blindness. It sees only forward, never down, never back. It assumes the ground will always be there. It believes that health is a permanent state, that time is elastic, that consequences are suggestions. Ethan was no different. He moved like the world owed him something. He spoke like silence was a vacuum that had to be filled. He stood in my kitchen and paced like standing still might kill him. I remembered when he was small, how he used to curl up beside me on the couch, resting his head on my shoulder, his body warm and still. He used to ask questions then, real ones, about the stars, about animals, about why the moon followed the car at night. Now his questions were rhetorical, angry, designed to push away rather than pull close. The softness had been replaced by sharp edges. He walked through the house like he was scouting enemy territory. Every object was a relic. The television was too small, the couch too old, the carpet too worn. He opened drawers and cabinets like he was looking for proof of how little I had changed. He didn't say it, but I could hear the thought in his movements. Why don't you modernize? Why don't you upgrade? Because I didn't want to. Because I had found a rhythm in this house, a peace that came from knowing where everything was, from the silence between ticking clocks, from the weight of years layered gently across surfaces. I didn't need screens or gadgets or noise. I needed memory. I needed space. I needed the quiet to think. He didn't understand that, and I didn't try to make him. Later that evening, he sprawled across the couch, legs hanging over the side, phone glowing in his hand. His thumbs moved rapidly, typing something with the intensity of someone solving a crisis that existed only on a screen. He didn't speak. He didn't look up. The light from the phone cast strange shadows on his face, making him look older and younger at the same time. I sat nearby, sipping my tea, listening to the soft click of his nails on glass. There was a kind of loneliness in him that he didn't yet recognize, a hollowness shaped like questions he hadn't asked. I saw it in the way he scrolled endlessly, in the way his eyes darted, in the way he laughed suddenly, and then grew silent again. He didn't know what he was looking for. He only knew that whatever it was, he hadn't found it. I thought about the blood that ran through him, the same blood that ran through me. It moved faster in his veins, hotter, louder. But it was the same blood, the same lineage, the same long thread connecting generations. He thought he was far from me, but he was only standing at the beginning of the same road. I wondered if he would ever understand that strength wasn't speed, and power wasn't noise, that wisdom was often mistaken for silence, and dignity for weakness. I wondered if he would ever see the cane not as a symbol of decay, but as proof of resilience. I doubted it would happen soon, but maybe one day, when his own hands trembled slightly as he reached for balance, he might remember. For now he was young, he was blood in motion, and I was the stillness he didn't know how to read. But I watched him, and I waited, not because I expected change, but because time was patient. Time had taught me that everything rushed eventually slows, and everything loud eventually listens, even young blood. It happened in a moment so small that most would have missed it. A gesture, a flick of the hand, a look that didn't last longer than a blink. But for me, it landed like the closing of a door I hadn't realized was open. We were standing in the front hallway. I had just come in from the backyard where I'd been pulling up the last of the dead summer flowers, stooping carefully, resting between stretches, the sun heavy on my back. I had leaned the cane beside the door while I took off my shoes. That's when Ethan came down the stairs, brushing past me without a word. He saw the cane. His eyes flicked to it, then to me. I was still bent slightly, one hand braced on the wall for balance. He didn't offer a hand. Instead, he stepped toward the cane and nudged it with his foot. Not gently, not playfully. He knocked it just hard enough that it fell over, clattering to the floorboards. Then he said it. 4 words, cool and clipped, spoken like a verdict. Stand up or fall. I froze, not because I couldn't move, but because something inside me stopped before my body did. My hand remained on the wall. My weight shifted unevenly across my knees, one leg stiff with the ache that always came after gardening. I looked down at the cane, lying there like a body. Useless, discarded, no longer welcome in the room. He didn't look back to see what I would do. He just walked past, already pulling out his phone, already disappearing into his world of swipes and screens and noise. I didn't speak. I bent slowly, gripping the edge of the wall with one hand, easing myself into a crouch the way a tired man kneels in church, not out of reverence, but out of necessity. I picked up the cane, brushing the dust from its handle, feeling the sting in my joints. I stood up on my own, not because I wanted to, but because I had no choice. My pride had its own bones, and they too ached. The silence in the hallway thickened. I stood there for a long time, longer than I should have, staring at the spot where the cane had landed. It wasn't just the object that had been pushed away. It was what it represented: age, dependency, weakness, at least in his eyes. In mine, it had always been something else. It had been part of the rhythm I had built to keep moving through a world that no longer moved at my pace. That night, I laid the cane beside the bed instead of propping it against the wall. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the distant thrum of Ethan's music leaking through the floorboards. It pulsed like a reminder that I was no longer the center of anyone's world. I was the background, the footnote, the page you skip when the story moves too fast. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. I just felt the coldness of being reduced to an inconvenience. The next morning, I made breakfast as usual. 2 eggs, toast, a slice of tomato. I poured coffee into the chipped mug Margaret had once insisted we throw away. I liked its imperfection. It reminded me that things didn't have to be whole to be useful. I set the cane by the chair before sitting down, as I always did. Ethan didn't come down. He was still asleep, or pretending to be. Either way, the silence felt different now. Not empty, but strained. I remembered when I first started using the cane. It had been after a long walk to the hardware store during an icy February. I had slipped just once, my heel skimming a patch of black ice on the sidewalk. I didn't fall, but my hip sent a message that didn't fade for weeks. A doctor recommended a cane, just for a little while. But I knew better. I knew it was the beginning of a different chapter. I resisted it at first. I left it in the closet. I convinced myself I could manage. Then came the day I tripped while coming down the porch steps. There was no injury, only bruised palms and a bruised ego. But that evening, I took out the cane and gave in to what my body already knew. I needed help. Not all the time, but sometimes. Enough. Over time, it became second nature. I didn't think of it as a failure. I thought of it as a tool, the same way I thought of reading glasses or grabber sticks for the high cabinets. The world wasn't built for older bodies. I adapted. The cane gave me confidence on uneven sidewalks, on wet grocery store floors, on church steps and parking lots. It wasn't shameful. It was smart. But to Ethan, it was something else entirely. To him, it was a sign I had given up, that I had surrendered to decline, that I had chosen fragility over fight. He didn't say these things out loud, but I knew. You can hear judgment in silence, see it in posture, feel it in the way someone looks at the object that keeps you standing. That evening, I walked the perimeter of the yard without it, just to prove I could. My stride was slower, less steady. I felt every shift in the soil beneath my shoes. But I made it around. One circle, then another. The sun was setting by the time I came back inside. My knees throbbed. My back tensed. I sat in the kitchen and drank water slowly, tasting the copper edge of fatigue. Later, I watched Ethan come down the stairs. He didn't notice the way I leaned into the counter as I stood. He didn't ask about my day, and I didn't offer it. He opened the fridge, made a sandwich, and returned upstairs. Not a word passed between us, just footsteps and a door closing. I stared at the place where the cane now rested beneath the table, hidden from sight. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I wanted to see who I became without it. For the rest of that week, I tested myself. I walked without it inside the house. I timed my movements. I practiced rising from the chair without gripping the armrest. I steadied myself against walls, counted the seconds it took my knees to hold. It was not a return to strength. It was an exercise in balance, in control. I was reclaiming the measure of what remained, not pretending I had regained what was lost. Still, something had shifted, not just in my body, but in the quiet between us. The act of pushing the cane away had done more than challenge my bones. It had cracked the floor beneath our relationship. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, no repair. Only time, ticking forward like a metronome we could no longer agree on. I kept the cane nearby, but not visible. I used it when he wasn't around. I gripped it tightly on trips to the grocery store, to the post office, to the pharmacy. It remained my companion, even as I pretended I had outgrown it. I hadn't. I never would. But pride has its own rituals. One night, as I was locking the front door, I saw it leaning in the corner like a sentry waiting to be called. I stared at it for a long while. Then I picked it up, not because I needed it that moment, but because it deserved better than being hidden. I laid it gently across the table, parallel to the paper. I ran my fingers along the grain of the wood, the familiar ridges where my hand had worn it smooth. That cane had caught me every time life tried to tip me over. It was not a weakness. It was proof that I had stood up, again and again, even after being pushed. The silence in the house didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, like cold air through an old window pane, barely noticeable at first, until one day it filled every room. It was not the silence of peace, nor the kind that offered clarity. It was the kind that pressed itself against your skin, settled in your chest, and made your own footsteps sound too loud. I noticed it most at night, after the hum of the day had quieted. The dishwasher no longer ran, the furnace clicked off, the creak of the porch swing stopped. Ethan would retreat to the spare room upstairs, headphones on, lost in a digital world, and I would sit in the armchair in the living room, hands folded over my stomach, listening. Not to anything in particular, but to the nothingness itself. The clock ticked steadily, marking each second as if they were meaningful. The refrigerator buzzed once every so often, then sighed like an old animal settling down. But beyond that, there was just space. After Margaret passed, I had filled the silence with tasks. I painted the porch railing. I organized the basement. I rearranged the books on the shelves alphabetically, then by author, then by year. I swept the driveway, even when it was already clean. I tried to drown the emptiness with motion, to outpace the ache that lingered in the corners. But motion is temporary. Eventually, the broom rests. The hammer is set down. The dust settles, and the silence returns. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I had grown to prefer it in many ways. There was no one to answer to, no need to explain why I read the same page 3 times, or why I watched the same documentary about national parks over and over again. I moved at my own speed, thought at my own depth, listened to my own breath. But solitude and silence were not the same. Solitude gave me space. Silence reminded me that space was empty. Sometimes I would walk through the house at night, just to prove to myself that it was still mine. I would touch the back of the kitchen chairs, run my hand along the edge of the counter, straighten a stack of magazines that no one would ever read. I would stand in the doorway of the room where Ethan slept, listening for signs of life. A faint laugh through his headphones, the click of a keyboard, the occasional mutter to himself. He was alive, yes, but unreachable. He lived in the same house, but in a different world. In the mornings, the house echoed differently. The light came in through the blinds in long stripes across the wooden floor, illuminating the dust that floated like forgotten thoughts. I moved through the rooms slowly, as if the silence might shatter if I walked too fast. The radio stayed off. The television remained dark. Even the kettle seemed reluctant to whistle. The walls had grown used to this quiet, and I had too. I began to notice how long it had been since I had heard my own name spoken aloud. Not Grandpa, or Sir, or a mumbled, "Hey," but my actual name. Charles. It hung in the air only in my own voice now, spoken internally when I reminded myself to get the mail, to pay the bill, to sit down, and rest my legs. I said it once, softly, in the bathroom mirror. It startled me, the sound, like hearing a note from a forgotten song. I smiled, then fell quiet again. The memories in the house made their own noise, not in words, but in sensations. The weight of Margaret's presence in the bedroom closet, still filled with her cardigans. The echo of laughter in the dining room from Thanksgiving dinners that ended hours after dessert. The faint scent of soap she used to keep in the linen drawers, still lingering despite the passage of time. These were the house's voices now, and I had learned to listen. Ethan rarely noticed the silence, or if he did, he pretended not to. He filled his ears with music, his eyes with screens, his mind with distractions. When he came downstairs, it was to pass through, not to sit, not to share. He walked quickly, spoke briefly, and moved on. He was a visitor here, even when he stayed for days. There was a particular evening, I remember. The sky outside had turned a pale gray, the kind that hinted at snow. I had just finished folding laundry and sat down in the den with a book I'd read before. I didn't open it. I held it in my lap and listened. Ethan had left the door to his room slightly ajar, and I could hear the distant sound of his laughter. Not warm or full, but sharp, clipped, as if reacting to something on a screen. It didn't touch the rest of the house. It ended before it could travel down the stairs. That was the thing about digital life. It was full of sounds, but none of them reached the furniture, the walls, the floors. None of them sank in. They bounced, hollow and directionless, never making a dent in the silence that held the rest of the house in its grip. I sometimes spoke to myself in small murmurs, not full sentences, just observations. "Tea's ready," I might say. Or, "That light bulb's gone." It wasn't for communication. It was an attempt to hear a voice that belonged in these rooms. It reminded me I was still here, still anchored. At night, when I turned out the lights, the silence grew thick again. It crept under doors and into drawers. It settled into the cushion beside me, the pillow beside my head. I didn't fight it anymore. I let it be what it was. A presence, a condition, a companion. There was one thing I noticed about silence. It made you honest. Without noise to distract or mask or soften, you heard your thoughts for what they really were. You heard the truth in the way your feet dragged across the floor, in the way your hand reached for the banister, in the way your heart paused before sitting down, unsure if the chair was where you left it. The silence told me things I had ignored, about age, about fear, about the way grief never really left. It just stopped knocking. I wondered if Ethan would ever feel this kind of silence. I doubted it. Not yet. His world was still too full of motion, too crowded with the sound of things demanding attention. But one day, maybe, when his body slowed, and the visitors stopped calling, and the echoes of memory got louder than the present moment, he might understand. He might hear what I had been hearing all along. Until then, I moved through the quiet like a man walking through snow, each step careful, deliberate, and alone. The house didn't mind. It had seen more winters than I had, and it knew how to hold a silence that lasted. I often stared at my hands without realizing I was doing it. They'd rest in my lap, one folded over the other, or hang loosely at my sides when I stood at the sink or stove. There was something about them that drew my attention, not with alarm, but with a kind of quiet recognition. They didn't look the way they used to. The skin had grown thin, almost translucent in places, and the veins traced long, raised roads beneath the surface. My knuckles were larger now, swollen from time and use. Age had carved itself into them like an old map, each wrinkle marking a year, each scar a place I'd been. I remembered what they used to be capable of. These hands once tied Ethan's shoes on the front porch before his first day of school. They had buttoned his shirts, wiped jelly from his chin, brushed dirt from his knees. They built bookcases and fixed leaks. They cracked walnuts in December and held Margaret's fingers gently when she had trouble sleeping. I'd held diplomas with them, and once, a rifle. I'd held steering wheels and snow shovels, paycheck envelopes and birthday cards. I used to take their strength for granted. Back then, they could lift furniture, flip soil, carry grocery bags in both arms without dropping anything. They didn't tremble when reaching for a glass. They didn't fumble with keys or medicine bottles. They were tools of certainty, direct, capable, strong. Now they moved more slowly. I had to think before doing things that once came without thought. Turning the knob on a stubborn jar lid, threading a needle, even folding sheets required more concentration than I liked to admit. Sometimes, when my hands were tired, I would hold them under warm water for a while, letting the heat soften the stiffness. It helped, but not always. There was no shame in it, not really, just a lingering sorrow that time couldn't be undone, that the same hands that once carried a toddler with ease now needed support to steady themselves on the edge of a countertop. I didn't speak of it to anyone. What would be the point? People younger than me saw old hands and thought only of what was lost, not of what those hands had survived. The calluses had faded over the years, but not completely. On my right palm, there was still a patch from where I'd gripped rakes and hammers. My fingers curled slightly when at rest, a stiffness I'd gotten used to. My nails grew slowly and unevenly now, and I trimmed them with more caution than I used to. I kept them clean, though. Always clean. That much I could still manage with pride. One afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table peeling apples for a pie I never finished. The peels curled onto the cutting board like red ribbons, and I watched my hands move with the same rhythm they had used for decades. They hesitated slightly, not because they'd forgotten the motion, but because the knife no longer obeyed the way it once had. Still, I peeled, quietly, methodically, slice after slice, breathing into the moment like it might restore something I couldn't name. I thought of the photographs in the hallway, the wedding portrait, the black and white snapshot of me holding Ethan as a baby, the group photo of my final year as a teacher. In all of them, my hands were there, unnoticed, doing what they were meant to do, holding, supporting, teaching, touching the world in ways that mattered. Margaret used to joke that my hands looked like they belonged to a carpenter, not a teacher. She said they were built for building, not chalkboards, and in a way, she was right. I taught history, but my hands made things. They gave structure to the abstract. They turned wood and screws into meaning, turned vegetables into meals, turned pages into stories for children who needed to be reminded the past wasn't just a test to pass. As I got older, the memory of what my hands had done became more vivid than what they still could do. I could recall with exact detail the sensation of smoothing down the edges of a freshly sanded table, the weight of a toddler's head resting in the crook of my elbow, the sharp thrill of a cold doorknob on a winter morning, the satisfying resistance of turning a tight bolt. My hands had been my language in the world, my way of showing up without noise. They had held everything that mattered. I knew Ethan didn't see them that way. He saw hands that dropped spoons, that struggled with buttons, that hesitated before standing. He didn't mean to be cruel. He simply hadn't lived long enough to understand what strength looks like after it's been tested 1,000 times. Youth recognizes only the flex, the lift, the quick. It doesn't see the power in endurance, in precision, in the restraint not to tremble when everything inside wants to. I sat one evening in the armchair, the light from the window falling across the backs of my hands. I turned them over slowly, palms up, palms down, studying them like an old photo I hadn't seen in years. I thought about how these hands had written letters and checks and essays, how they had lifted Margaret when she could no longer walk on her own, how they had caught Ethan when he fell off his bike, covered in dirt and panic, how they had held my own face once, after the doctor used the word degenerative. I didn't pity them. I honored them. I laid one hand over the other and closed my eyes, breathing in the weight of the years they carried. I didn't need them to be strong anymore. I only needed them to stay with me, to keep holding, to keep steadying, to keep remembering. Because they remembered. Far better than my voice or my memory ever could. They remembered everything I had ever done to keep this house standing, to keep this family upright, to keep myself from falling too fast through the cracks of time. And when the silence returned, when Ethan had gone to bed, when the house was still, when even the clock seemed to hesitate between ticks, it was my hands that anchored me. Not as proof of what had been lost, but of what had survived. Not as symbols of age, but as testimonies of a life lived fully, one grip at a time. There was no sound when the shift happened, no raised voice, no slammed door, no thunderclap of realization. But something changed, subtle, silent, and permanent. It was the kind of change you don't see until you've walked far past the point of no return, and look back to realize the ground you stood on had vanished. I didn't know it that evening, as I sat at the kitchen table watching the sky go dark beyond the window, but I had crossed a line that would never uncross, and Ethan had too. It began with a moment, a passing one, so small it would have gone unnoticed to anyone else. I had just finished rinsing out my cup, letting the warm water run over my hands longer than needed, as I often did. The faucet was slow to close. I had to turn the handle just right to stop the drip. Ethan passed through the kitchen, grabbed something from the counter, a set of keys, maybe, or a bottle of soda, and moved toward the door. I turned slightly, perhaps to say something, perhaps not. But he didn't look at me. He was already halfway out, his body aimed toward the world beyond the walls. I watched him go without a word, not because I had nothing to say, but because I felt, acutely, that anything I said wouldn't land, wouldn't matter. The distance between us wasn't measured in square footage. It was an invisible line, drawn somewhere between the look he gave the cane and the silence he gave me now. That line ran through the living room, where he never sat, through the hallway, where his footsteps quickened, through the dinner table, where he took his plate and ate, standing near the sink, through my gestures, through his expressions, through the moments when he looked at me but didn't see me. That line separated the man I had been from the man he now believed me to be. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I sat back down at the table and placed my palms flat on the wood. The grain was warm from the sunlight that had touched it earlier, but the surface felt distant, like a memory of something I once knew intimately, but could no longer access. I traced a crack along the edge with my finger and thought of how many times Margaret had set down her tea mug in that exact spot. How many times I had read the paper with my elbows planted firmly right where my hands now rested. But the table didn't carry those sounds anymore. Only the echo of one set of footsteps now. There was no argument, no betrayal, no single event I could point to and say, "There, that's where we changed." But the change was real. Ethan no longer asked questions. He no longer lingered after a sentence to hear my answer. I had become background, necessary maybe, respected in a formal way, but not needed in the way a person wants to be sought out for wisdom or comfort or presence. I was tolerated. I was convenient. And that cut deeper than any spoken wound ever could. I watched the way he moved through my space, like a man walking through a museum, glancing at the past, but untouched by it. His hands never brushed the books on the shelf. He never paused to look at the family photos in the hallway. He didn't ask about the names carved in the wooden bench on the porch, names that had meant everything to me once. He didn't ask, and I stopped offering. That was the first surrender, I think. The moment I stopped offering, not out of bitterness, but preservation. You can only extend a hand so many times before you learn to rest it in your lap and keep it warm. I didn't want to be hurt by his indifference, so I retracted slowly, like a snail into its shell, and I let the silence grow between us like ivy on a wall. It wasn't hostile. It was just thick and quiet. I began to move differently through the house, more quietly, more deliberately. I waited until he left to do certain things, to vacuum, to water the plants, to take out the recycling. I told myself it was to avoid getting in his way, but the truth was, I didn't want to be seen fumbling with the lid of the trash can or steadying myself against the counter. I didn't want to give him more reasons to see me as weak. The line between us sharpened each time I caught that look in his eyes. Not cruelty, not even judgment, but a kind of pity. I would have preferred anger. I started sleeping in later, rising only after I heard his footsteps leave the upstairs. I delayed my breakfast, sat outside longer in the mornings, let the tea steep too long. I filled my day with small acts that no one noticed, polishing the brass doorknob, tightening the hinges on the old kitchen cabinet, cleaning behind the radiator. Each task a way of insisting, silently, that I still mattered. One afternoon, I found myself in the attic. I hadn't been up there in years. I climbed the stairs slowly, holding the railing with both hands, my knees resisting every step. The air was dry and smelled of old boxes, cardboard, cedar, and dust. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I opened the trunk that held old papers, photo albums, tools I no longer used. I sat on the floor, knees bent awkwardly, back sore from the climb, and opened a box of Margaret's old letters. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, thoughtful. I ran my fingers over the ink, imagining the weight of her hand, the way her pen must have moved across the paper. I read one letter twice, then a third time, not because I'd forgotten the words, but because the voice in them felt like something I needed to hear. She had written about Ethan when he was 5, about the way he clung to my pant leg when strangers came to the house, about how he called me his big strong tree. That line again, the one that once connected us. Once I had been the anchor. Now I was the shore he drifted from. Back downstairs, I placed the letter on the mantel and stood there for a long while. I didn't cry, but something hollow expanded in my chest, like the echo of a bell that had stopped ringing. I knew then that Ethan wouldn't cross the line back toward me. Not soon. Maybe not ever. And it wasn't his fault. It was the world's pace, the tide of life that pulls the young away from the old with such quiet inevitability that you don't even notice until you're standing alone in a room where once there were voices. Still, I set an extra place at the table that evening. Not for him, not really, but for the idea of him, the memory of the boy who once asked me to show him how to tie a knot, to tell him a story, to lift him onto my shoulders so he could touch the sky. I set the plate gently, unfolded the napkin, placed the fork, just so. It stayed empty. I crossed the line again, just once, to look into his room before I went to bed. He was there, lit by the glow of his screen, his face bathed in flickering blue. He didn't see me. I didn't say his name. I closed the door gently, not to shut him out, but to remind myself of the boundary. Not marked by walls, not marked by time, just an invisible line drawn by life itself. And I had stepped over it for the last time. The second day arrived without ceremony. No announcements, no storm rolling in, no sudden shift in the wind. Just morning light filtered through half-closed blinds and the faint scent of rain from the night before, still clinging to the grass. I woke up the same way I had the day before, slowly, cautiously, measuring the stiffness in my joints before swinging my legs over the side of the bed. I sat there a while, letting my breath catch up to my bones before I stood. It was quiet downstairs, the kind of quiet that told me Ethan had already left or hadn't come home. The house had a way of revealing his absence. The air felt undisturbed. The cushion on the couch was still dented the way I left it, and the remote control hadn't moved. His shoes weren't by the door. His energy, normally scattered across the rooms like static electricity, wasn't anywhere. Just absence. Heavy and clear. I boiled water for tea and stood by the sink, watching the steam rise. The house groaned slightly as it settled, the way it always did when the sun began to warm the roof. I carried my mug to the table, taking small steps, steady ones, the cane tapping softly against the floor. I had picked it up again. There was no defiance in that choice, just acceptance. It was not weakness to know your limit. It was wisdom, and I was long past needing to explain that to anyone. My hands curled around the ceramic mug, fingers stiffer than usual. The morning air had a bite to it, and the ache in my knuckles warned me of coming rain. I sipped slowly. The tea was too strong, left to steep too long again. I didn't mind. Bitter things had become easier to take. The second day always came harder than the first. The first is fueled by reaction, by adrenaline, by instinct, by disbelief. The second is where the realization settles, where the weight begins to sink into the muscles, where the echo of what happened loops over and over again in the back of the mind, like a scratched record. I sat there in that silence, knowing something had cracked open, and that it could not be patched with pleasantries or habits. I looked at the corner of the room where the cane usually rested. Yesterday, it had been knocked to the ground. Today, it stood where I had returned it, upright, steady, silent, a witness to whatever this chapter of life had become. Around mid-morning, I stepped outside. The porch boards moaned beneath my feet, the same groan they had made for years, the kind of sound that feels almost like a greeting. I stood at the top step and looked out across the yard. The oak tree was shedding faster now, its leaves forming a slow drift across the lawn. I had raked them the day before, but the wind had undone my work. Nature's quiet indifference. I bent to retrieve the rake from where it leaned against the siding. My back complained. My shoulder ached. I ignored both. The rhythm of the rake pulling through the leaves was a comfort. It required no thought, just movement. And in movement, I could let my mind rest. I lost track of time out there, as I often did. The clouds thickened, the sky dimmed, and my shadow faded until there was none. I gathered the leaves into a pile and stood back, chest heaving slightly. Not from effort, but from age. There was a difference. I turned toward the house and saw Ethan's car in the driveway. I hadn't heard it pull in. He sat behind the wheel, head bowed slightly, one hand gripping the steering wheel long after the engine had stopped. He didn't move, didn't open the door, just sat there, still, as if waiting for a cue from something larger than himself. I didn't wave. I didn't call out. I simply stood there, rake in hand, watching. Eventually, he stepped out. His shoulders were hunched, his walk slower than usual. He wasn't wearing his usual expression of half-formed detachment. Something had shifted. It was in the way he avoided my eyes, in the way he moved toward the house, not around me. He passed close by, and for a moment I thought he might speak. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came. Then, as if the moment demanded a gesture, he turned back and glanced at me. Briefly. Long enough for me to see it. Exhaustion. Uncertainty. Something that resembled remorse, though it hadn't fully arrived. He looked like someone who had learned something the hard way, and didn't yet know how to name it. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. The second day was always when truth began to surface, when the easy narratives peeled away, and something raw emerged beneath. Whatever he had gone through the night before, whatever had been said, or done, or realized, it had left its mark. I returned to my raking, letting him pass. He went inside without another word. The door closed gently behind him. No slamming, no echoes. Later that afternoon, I came back inside and found him sitting at the kitchen table. My table. The same one I had sat at that morning, tracing cracks in the wood. He was hunched over, elbows on the surface, staring into a glass of water. He looked up when I entered, but didn't speak. I nodded. He nodded. That was it. We stayed that way for a while. Me standing, him sitting. Two figures suspended in the stillness of things unspoken. There was no need to explain what the day had done to each of us. We were both different now. The second day had seen to that. When he finally stood, it was slower than usual, and when he walked past me, he didn't move with the same quick indifference. There was hesitation, a pause before each step, as though his body remembered something it hadn't felt before. Maybe pain, maybe reflection. The second day doesn't always bring answers, but it brings clarity. The kind that doesn't arrive in a moment, but accumulates, quietly, insistently, like leaves gathering on a lawn. And sometimes, all you can do is rake them into a pile, stand back, and let the wind decide what stays. That evening, I sat down at the dining table earlier than usual. I hadn't lit the overhead light yet, and the last of the sun slipped across the floor in golden strips, reaching halfway up the legs of the chairs like tentative fingers. The house was still. Ethan was upstairs, though I hadn't heard movement from his room in over an hour. I assumed he was asleep or pretending to be. Either way, the space between us had grown quieter again, but not in the same way as before. Something was shifting. I could feel it in the weight of the silence. I had set the table for two. I did it without thinking, just as I had done for years with Margaret. The ritual lived in my hands, not my memory. One plate, then another. Knife on the right, fork on the left. A folded napkin, plain, nothing fancy. The chairs didn't match. The one across from me had a different backrest, replaced years ago when the original broke. It always looked a little out of place, but no one cared. It did its job. Until now. Now, it just sat there, empty. I sipped my tea slowly, staring at that chair. It wasn't just the absence of someone in it that struck me. It was the history that hung over it like a shadow. That seat had held many people over the years. Ethan, when he was little, swinging his legs, slurping soup with more noise than grace. Margaret, folding her hands in prayer before every meal. Friends, neighbors, students once invited for holiday dinners. Laughter had risen from that chair. Arguments had sparked across it. Now it held none of that. Only stillness. I didn't move to clear it. I left it set, not out of hope, but out of memory. The act of preparing space for another was something I refused to give up. It mattered, even if no one filled it. It reminded me of what had been and what might be again. Not in the same way, perhaps, but in some quiet form. The air in the dining room carried the faint scent of lemon oil from the furniture polish I had used that afternoon. The wood gleamed faintly in the dimming light. I reached out and ran my hand along the table's edge. smooth, worn in places, a small chip on the corner where Ethan once dropped his fork and tried to catch it mid-air. I never sanded it down. It was part of the table's story now. I found myself listening again, not for footsteps this time, but for something else, for the sound of the upstairs floorboard that creaked when someone shifted their weight, for the subtle rhythm of movement. But there was nothing, just the steady hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the occasional sigh of the furnace. The chair across from me seemed to grow larger in the silence. It drew attention not by its presence, but by its emptiness. There's a peculiar weight to something unoccupied, like a question that waits too long for an answer. I found myself remembering all the times I had sat across from someone. Margaret's eyes, tired but kind. Ethan's younger face, defiant and curious. And now I sat alone, watching the light recede. I didn't resent the quiet. I had made peace with it long ago, but I did feel its shape differently now. It was no longer just silence. It was space withheld, space that should have held connection, but didn't. It was an invitation that had been quietly declined. After a while, I pushed back from the table, the legs of my chair scraping softly against the floor. I didn't clear the second place setting. I left it there, untouched, as if it still served a purpose simply by existing. I moved to the living room, easing into my armchair with a familiar groan from the cushion beneath me. From that seat, I could still see the edge of the dining table through the doorway. The empty chair sat in my line of vision, unwavering, unchanged. A sentinel of quiet, bearing witness to the passage of days. I thought of all the chairs in my life. The desk chair in my classroom, where I sat grading papers long into the night. The wooden bench outside the courthouse where Margaret and I had once waited for the adoption papers to go through. The rocking chair on the porch, where I had held Ethan when he was still small enough to fall asleep in my arms. Chairs hold stories. They hold weight, not just the weight of bodies, but of time, memory, routine. An empty chair is never just empty. It's full of everything that used to be there, and sometimes everything that still should be. Later that night, I turned out the lights one room at a time, as I always did. When I reached the dining room, I paused by the table. The second place setting remained. The fork caught a glint of moonlight through the window. I didn't touch it. I didn't move the chair. I let them stay as they were, a quiet declaration that I still knew how to make room for someone, even when they weren't ready to sit down. The next morning, I would set the table again. Maybe for two, maybe just for one. But the chair would remain, and I would wait, not with expectation, but with understanding. Because sometimes, the act of leaving a space open is the most generous thing you can do. And I had always been generous with chairs. Time didn't speak in words. It spoke in slower mornings, in creaking knees, in the half-second pause before getting up from a chair. It didn't shout or argue. It whispered, persistent and calm, until one day the voice of time was louder than your own. I had learned to listen, not just because I had to, but because ignoring it didn't make it stop. Time kept moving. It always did. It was the one teacher that never quit, never softened, never skipped a lesson. That week, time moved in strange ways. Not fast, not slow, just uneven. Some hours stretched, others vanished. I would find myself staring at the same page in a book, not reading, not even remembering how I'd gotten there. Or I'd glance at the clock and be startled that afternoon had become evening. Everything around me kept going. Appliances clicked on and off. The sun moved across the windows. But I felt like I was standing still, like I'd stepped out of the rhythm everyone else still danced to. Ethan moved through the house differently, too. He wasn't loud. He didn't move quickly or carelessly. There was a heaviness to his steps now, a hesitation. I watched him from the living room once as he stood in the kitchen, hand on the back of the chair, not sitting, not walking away, just standing. That was new. Stillness had never fit him before, Now it wrapped around him like a coat he wasn't used to wearing. I didn't ask what had changed. I didn't press. That was one of the first lessons time had taught me, that people only reveal themselves when they're ready, and pushing them never helps. I had made peace with silence. I'd learned to find meaning in gestures, in pauses, in the way someone's eyes lingered on an object longer than needed. One morning, I heard him wake before me. His footsteps upstairs were quiet, measured. I stayed in bed a little longer than usual, letting the warmth of the blanket hold me. When I finally rose and made my way to the kitchen, the table had one plate already set, one mug, and the kettle was still warm. He wasn't there, but he had been. That was enough. I sat down slowly, the cane resting against the edge of the table, and poured myself a cup. The tea was too strong again, just the way I liked it. He hadn't known that. I was sure of it. It was a mistake, but it made me smile, because it meant he had at least tried. That small act felt louder than all the noise he'd made before. Later that day, I stepped outside to tend to the last of the garden beds. The earth was beginning to harden for the season. I wore gloves now, not to protect my hands, but to cover the way my fingers curled slightly when cold. The hose had been rolled up. The tools leaned neatly against the shed. I hadn't asked him to do any of that, but someone had, and I hadn't done it. As I knelt down to check the soil, my knee gave a familiar protest. I braced myself, moved slower. That wasn't new. What was new was hearing footsteps behind me and realizing they had stopped a few feet away. I didn't turn around. I kept working, letting the silence between us settle. He didn't speak, but he didn't leave either. Time was doing its work, not just on my body, but on him too. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the long arc of my life, about how many times I had ignored the lessons I was too young to understand, about the people I had once dismissed, believing I had all the answers, only to realize years later how much they had carried in silence. I thought of my father, how I used to grow impatient with his pace, how I had thought his routines were outdated, how I had mistaken his quiet for irrelevance. I thought of the day I found his tools arranged in perfect order after he passed, and how I stood there, ashamed of how little I had understood him. I was beginning to see that pattern repeating itself now. The young running ahead, the old slowing down, the middle ground often left unexplored. But age had given me something I hadn't expected, perspective without bitterness. I didn't resent Ethan for what he hadn't seen yet. I had been him once. Time had softened that anger in me. It had worn it down like river water smoothing a stone. What remained wasn't resentment, but clarity. I didn't need him to apologize. I didn't need him to transform overnight. I only needed him to learn at his own pace, and he was learning. The signs were there. A dish washed, a door held open. The cane no longer treated like a symbol of failure, but like something to be acknowledged, maybe even respected. These were small shifts, but time taught me to notice the small things, because they were always the beginning of something larger. One afternoon, I found him in the garage, organizing a box of old screws and nails. He didn't know I was watching. His hands moved with unfamiliar care, not in a rush, not tossing things aside. He picked up a wooden handle from a broken shovel and examined it for a long time. Then he set it aside, gently. That wasn't the behavior of someone who dismissed what came before him. That was the beginning of reverence. The lesson of time isn't taught in a single day. It's whispered over years, layered in the ordinary, tucked into routines. It's in the waiting, in the listening, in the spaces between what is said and what is done. Ethan didn't know it, but time had begun to teach him. Not through me, not through lectures or consequences, but through the way the world slowly shows itself when you stop rushing through it. When you start to see the cracks in the wood, the wear in the handles, the steadiness in something once mocked. I no longer worried about whether he would see me the way I used to be. I knew he wouldn't. He didn't know that version of me. but I began to believe he might come to understand the man I had become, not in strength, not in volume, but in endurance, in quiet presence, in the way I remained, even when unseen. Time had given me that lesson, and I had earned it. Every wrinkle, every pause, every morning that started slower than the one before, it all added up to something he couldn't yet measure. But one day, he would. And when that day came, he would remember the way I waited without pushing, the way I stood without falling, the way I aged without asking for praise, the way time, with all its patience, had shaped us both. That morning, I didn't say a word. I woke before the sun had reached the window, before the furnace kicked on, before the birds started their low rustling in the hedges outside the bedroom. I sat up slowly, letting my body remind me of its own limits, and placed both feet on the floor, feeling the grain of the wooden boards beneath my soles. The cane leaned where it always did, within reach, its curve waiting patiently for my fingers. I stood and moved through the house in silence. Not a strained silence, a chosen one. I made breakfast without turning on the radio. The kettle took longer to boil than usual, or maybe I was simply noticing it more. I moved slower these days, not out of reluctance, but because everything deserved time. Even toast, even the clink of a spoon against the side of a ceramic mug. Ethan came downstairs while I was spreading jam across a piece of bread. He moved differently now, not louder or softer, but with a kind of deliberateness I hadn't seen in him before. He stood for a moment near the hallway entrance, and I felt him looking at me, waiting for something. A greeting, a question, an opening. I kept my eyes on the toast, finished the task, and sat down at the table. He joined me a few minutes later without a word, and we sat like that, side by side in the hush of morning, two shapes defined more by what they didn't say than what they could. The chair across from me, the one I always left set, remained untouched. I had stopped setting the second plate, not out of bitterness, but clarity. Some messages were clearer when left unspoken. There had been a time when I would have filled that silence with commentary, small talk, something about the weather, the trees, the birds that came back too early in the year. But I had grown out of that need, or rather, time had peeled it away from me. The older I became, the more I understood that silence was not emptiness. It was space, space where truth could live without being pushed into the open. Ethan cleared his plate and ran the water in the sink. He didn't scrub, just rinsed, letting the motion do the talking. I watched his shoulders as he stood there, the way they dropped slightly, as if carrying something unseen. When he turned, I met his eyes briefly. I didn't look away. Neither did he. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't even an exchange. It was a moment of still recognition, that I was still here, that he was still learning, that neither of us would say what we were really thinking, but that it didn't make it any less real. Later, I walked to the porch and sat down with my tea. The wind moved gently across the yard, stirring the dry leaves into slow circles. I pulled the blanket across my knees and leaned back into the chair, the wood creaking beneath me, familiar and forgiving. The cane rested beside me, upright, reliable, a silent companion. He came outside after a while. He stood near the edge of the steps, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the horizon like there was something waiting out there to be found. He didn't speak. He didn't ask to join me. But he didn't walk away either. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I felt his presence in the way the air shifted, in the stillness between us. It struck me then that some of the most profound answers I'd received in my life had come without words. Margaret had once pressed her hand to mine in the hospital without speaking, and I understood everything I needed to know. My father had once nodded at me from across a room after I fixed the gate, and in that gesture, I felt more pride than any speech could have given. And now, my grandson stood near me, saying nothing, but letting the quiet carry what neither of us could frame with sentences. I remembered when Ethan was a boy, and would get frustrated when I didn't answer his questions right away. He thought silence meant I didn't hear him or didn't care. I tried to explain that sometimes you had to let the answer grow on its own, like roots in the dark. He never understood then. But maybe now, standing there in the space between his youth and my age, he was beginning to. In the afternoon, he left for a while. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't remind him to drive carefully. I let him go, like the wind lets go of the leaves, not because I didn't care, but because I did. Enough to trust the distance. When he returned, he placed something on the table without saying anything. It was a small wooden box. I recognized it immediately. One of my old toolboxes. He had cleaned it, sanded it, repaired the latch. Inside were my old measuring tape, a pencil, a folded rag, a pair of worn gloves. I hadn't used them in years. I hadn't even remembered where they were. I looked at him. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just turned and went upstairs. I sat down at the table and ran my fingers over the lid of the box. The wood was smooth. The repair was careful, thoughtful. There were no words attached, no note, no explanation. But it was an answer, a silent answer to everything that had been left unsaid, to the way he had once dismissed the cane, to the look in his eyes that once saw only weakness, to the days when his footsteps avoided mine. It was his way of saying, "I see you now." I left the box where it was, centered on the table like a declaration. I didn't rush to put it away. I wanted it to sit in the open. I wanted it to breathe, to hold its own kind of presence. That night, I stood by the window in the dark, watching the streetlights hum softly in the distance. I heard his footsteps come down the stairs, slow and even. He paused in the hallway, not far behind me. I didn't turn. He didn't speak. But he stayed there, long enough to let me know he didn't need to. And in that stillness, I heard more than any apology could say. It was the answer I had waited for, and it came exactly the way I'd learned to expect it, quietly, respectfully, and right on time. The sun rose slowly that morning, stretching its pale light across the living room floor in long, uneven stripes. I sat in the armchair by the window, where the light touched the tops of my shoes, but didn't reach my knees. The cane rested beside me, upright and still. In the quiet, I could hear the breath of the house, timid creaks in the floorboards, the low groan of settling beams, the hum of life continuing without spectacle. The air was thick with the feeling of something waiting, not tension, not dread. Just a hush before something important makes itself known. I hadn't always thought about legacy, not in the way young people use the word. I had never been concerned with my name on plaques or buildings, never imagined books written about me or benches dedicated in my honor. But the older I got, the more I realized that legacy wasn't something grand. It was something quiet, something slow. It was in the things left behind that no one noticed at first. The grooves in a handrail, the way a drawer opens smoothly after years of tending, the way a room holds its breath when someone new enters. Legacy was the warmth in a house when it should have gone cold. That morning, I found myself thinking about the tools I used to keep in the basement. Not the ones you buy to show off, but the ones passed down from someone else, heavy with age and coated in the memory of work. A hammer with a worn grip. A square I'd used to align every corner of every shelf I ever built. A chisel with a chipped handle that still knew how to bite, cleaned through stubborn wood. I had used those tools not just to build things, but to build a life. I had repaired furniture when we couldn't afford to replace it. I had fixed neighbors' fences because it was the right thing to do. I had shown Ethan once how to hold a level steady with 2 hands, though he was too young to care at the time. He had watched, then wandered away. Now he had brought one of those boxes upstairs, cleaned, repaired, not forgotten. I stood slowly, using the cane for balance, and made my way to the dining table where the box still sat. I opened the latch with care, the sound familiar, the kind of click that settles into your bones. Inside, the tools were arranged neatly, the gloves folded, the pencil sharpened. He hadn't just dusted them. He had considered them, touched them with purpose. That meant something. I lifted the hammer and let it rest in my hand. Its weight was the same, but my grip had changed. The strength I once had in my wrists was gone, replaced by caution and memory. I didn't need to swing it. Just holding it was enough. It reminded me that things could still be passed on, not in words, but in presence, in the care someone takes with what came before them. As I held that hammer, I thought of all the things I had tried to build in my life that weren't made of wood or metal. I had tried to build patience in a world that valued speed. I had tried to build calm in a house that had once been full of chaos. I had tried to build understanding in a boy who didn't yet know how to look back. Margaret had once told me that people don't inherit objects. They inherit how you treated them. She believed that how you folded a blanket, or cleaned a plate, or fixed a broken hinge was its own kind of teaching. At the time, I thought she was just romanticizing chores, but now, standing there with an old hammer in my hand, I understood exactly what she meant. Ethan hadn't just fixed a toolbox. He had heard something in the silence. He had read something in the way I held myself, in the way I moved through the house, in the way I didn't speak when there was nothing left to explain. He had started to understand that the quiet work of aging wasn't a collapse. It was a continuation. The past few days had been different. Not dramatic. No confessions. Just quieter choices. Fewer screens. Longer pauses. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. The way he left the door open now instead of shutting it behind him. Small things. But legacy was always made of small things. In the afternoon, I pulled a small notebook from the drawer near the hallway. It had once been a ledger, but I had repurposed it. I wrote down the names of the tools in the box, one by one, with notes about where they came from. Not instructions, not diagrams, just stories. Where the hammer came from, what the square had once been used for, how Margaret had once used the chisel to wedge open a paint can on the day we painted the kitchen blue. I didn't write it for myself. I wrote it so that whoever held the box next would know it wasn't just a container of metal and wood. It was a history, a voice, a set of hands passed forward. When I finished, I closed the notebook and set it gently inside the box, beneath the gloves. Then I closed the lid and left it there, undisturbed. The rest of the day passed quietly. I trimmed the hedge outside a few minutes at a time. I folded laundry, feeling the warmth of the fabric between my hands. I dusted the mantel. And as I moved, I could feel the house settling around me, not as something I owned, but as something I had shaped, something I had given weight to, the kind of weight that stays even when you're gone. That evening, I returned to the chair by the window. The light was fading, casting long shadows across the rug. Ethan came downstairs, slower than usual, holding something in his hand. A photograph, I think, though I couldn't see it clearly. He sat on the edge of the couch, not quite looking at me, but not avoiding me either. We didn't speak, but we didn't need to. The weight of legacy was already in the room, not heavy, not burdensome, just present. I woke to rain, not the kind that crashes against the roof or hammers windows with fury, but the kind that whispers as it falls, gentle, steady, like a steady hand smoothing the folds of a wrinkled sheet. The sky outside was gray, the kind of gray that asks nothing from you, that simply wraps the world in quiet. I lay there for a few minutes longer than usual, listening to the soft drip from the eaves and the occasional tap of water against the porch rail. When I finally rose, my body protested as it always did. The knees, the back, the hip, familiar aches that no longer surprised me. I moved slowly through the house, my hand brushing the wall as I passed through the hall, the cane tapping once for every other step. Each sound echoed slightly, not into emptiness, but into fullness, The kind that accumulates over a lifetime of presence. The kind that says, I am still here. In the kitchen, the kettle steamed quietly on the stove. I didn't rush it. I never did. I prepared my tea with the care of a man who knew time wasn't the enemy. It was the teacher, the companion, the witness. I took my seat at the table and looked out the window, where the raindrops streaked the glass in slow, meandering trails. The toolbox was still there, closed, unmoved. It hadn't been touched since I placed the notebook inside. I didn't need to check it. Its presence was enough. It reminded me that something had been seen, something had been understood, not in dramatic fashion, not with fanfare or applause, but in the quiet way that mattered most. Across the room, the chair remained empty, but this time, it didn't feel like a void. It felt like space, deliberate, earned, waiting in a way that wasn't desperate. I had stopped setting 2 plates days ago, but this morning, I pulled out a second mug, not out of habit, but out of trust. It stayed untouched, and that was all right. Victory, I had learned, was rarely loud. It didn't march in with trumpets or shout from rooftops. It crept in softly, like morning fog, filling the corners of your home and your heart before you even realized it had arrived. It wasn't about winning something. It was about remaining yourself through the storm. It was about enduring when no one was watching. It was about sitting in the same chair every morning, quietly whole, quietly intact. That day moved slowly. I cleaned out a drawer in the hallway that I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old batteries, keys that fit no locks, a pack of playing cards missing the Queen of Hearts. I held them one by one, not to sort them, but to remember them. Each item a whisper from a life lived in full. In the afternoon, I walked to the porch and watched the rain thin out. The yard was saturated, the soil dark and rich. The leaves on the oak glistened, every edge softened by water. I stood there for a while, one hand on the railing, feeling the world breathe. The cane rested beside me, not needed in that moment, just present. I thought about Margaret then, about how she had once told me that the hardest part of aging wasn't the pain or the slowing down, but the being overlooked, the feeling of fading while still alive. I hadn't understood it when she said it. I do now. But I also understood something else, that fading isn't the same as disappearing, that quiet isn't the same as being erased. Inside, the house smelled of lemon oil and rain-soaked air. The books on the shelf remained in their uneven stacks. The photograph on the mantel tilted slightly to the right, just as it had for years. I didn't straighten it. Some things weren't meant to be perfect. They were meant to be real. As the evening settled in, the light grew softer, the sky dimmer. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I let the room darken naturally, the shadows growing longer, gentler. I sat in the armchair again, a blanket across my knees, the weight of the day resting evenly in my bones. Ethan came down the stairs just after sunset. His footsteps were measured, his breath even. He passed through the room without words, but he paused before the table. He looked at the second mug. He didn't touch it. He didn't comment. He just looked. Then he turned, and for a moment his hand rested on the back of the empty chair. That was enough. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The house had spoken for me. The cane, the box, the silence, the stillness. They had all said more than words ever could. When he went to the kitchen, I heard the water running, the soft clink of dishes, a small act, but in it, a kind of respect, a kind of recognition. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the weight of the moment settle in my chest, not as burden, but as proof. I had carried my years with dignity. I had remained steady even when unseen. I had given without demand, waited without complaint. This was victory, not the kind you write down or frame on a wall, but the kind you feel in your bones when the world has tried to bend you, and you have not broken. The kind that sits across from an empty chair, calm and unshaken, knowing you never stopped making room for someone to return. The kind that needs no applause, only silence, and the quiet knowledge that you endured. And that was more than enough.